Epilogue. Damian had always known hardship. A poor orphan from the countryside, he had survived through sheer determination, scraping by on whatever he could find. Fate, however, had something different in store for him. At the age of 13, he unknowingly set his life on a new course when he saved a nobleman and his daughter from an ambush. Lord Farquad, a man of influence and wealth, was traveling with his beloved daughter, Selena, when they were attacked by bandits. Damian, quick-witted and agile, intervened in the only way he knew how. By using his speed and knowledge of the terrain, he led the attackers away, using the trees and uneven ground to his advantage before eventually circling back and helping the noble guards finish them off. When the dust settled, Lord Farquad took note of the scrawny, dirt-covered boy who had risked his life for strangers. After hearing about Damian's circumstances, he made a decision that would change both their lives. He adopted Damian into his family. It was not an easy transition for Damian. Suddenly, he was thrust into a world of luxury and etiquette, a world so far removed from the struggles he had known. But gratitude overshadowed any discomfort. Lord Farquad decreed that Damian would attend school alongside Selena, both for his education and to act as her protector. Selena, who had never liked having bodyguards shadowing her every move, was delighted. She now had someone to accompany her freely, someone who wasn't just a hired sword. She wasted no time in taking Damian shopping, dragging him from store to store with a boundless enthusiasm that left him struggling to keep up. Selena, raised in a world where her preferences dictated everything around her, never thought to ask Damian what he might want. Instead, she picked out things she would have loved, the kind of items she thought were the best: pink pens, cute animal print notebooks, and a princess-themed book bag. It wasn't intentional, just the way she had been raised. If she liked something, then surely he would too. Damian, unfamiliar with the concept of choosing things for himself, quietly accepted them all. He had never owned much, so he wasn't about to complain about what was given to him. And when he saw how eagerly she selected everything, how her eyes lit up as she made each decision, he told himself that she must truly care. The warmth of that thought was enough for him to believe it. After their shopping spree, Selena's shopping spree, they went to her favorite restaurant. Damian, unfamiliar with the dishes, let Selena order for him. Everything she chose was something she adored, and though the rich flavors were unlike anything he had ever tasted, he ate each dish without complaint. He wasn't used to this kind of food, but if Selena enjoyed it, then perhaps it wasn't so bad. He listened to her chatter between bites, nodding at the appropriate times, watching the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about things she loved. And so, the days went on. Selena found in him a constant companion, and Damian found a life he never imagined he could have. Chapter 1. First year of school. From the very start, Selena clung to Damian, proudly declaring him her best friend. To the other students, they were an odd pair. Selena, a lively and social girl who drew people in with ease, and Damian, a quiet boy who preferred to observe rather than participate. He never saw himself as anything more than her support, a shadow meant to ensure her happiness and safety. And so, he did just that. In class, he absorbed knowledge like a sponge. But no matter how engrossed he was in his studies, he never hesitated to stop what he was doing if Selena needed something. Whether she wanted something explained, a drink, or a snack, he would immediately get it for her. If she forgot a book, he would offer his. If she was cold, he would drape his uniform jacket over her shoulders without a second thought. If she was tired in the library, he would shift their seating so she could lean against him without discomfort. It was instinctive. This was how it had always been since they met, so Selena never questioned it. But their classmates noticed. It wasn't long before they started teasing him about it. At first, it was lighthearted, jokes about him being Selena's personal attendant. But then they turned to his belongings, the pink pens, the cutesy notebooks, the princess book bag, items Selena had chosen for him. They mocked him for having such girlish things, asking why a boy would pick them. Selena, at first, was confused. She loved those items, so why did it matter if Damian had them too? He never complained about them, never said he disliked them. But before she could fully process these thoughts, one of her friends called her name, pulling her into another conversation, and the moment was forgotten. Damian, however, did not forget. He never let their words show on his face, never reacted in a way that would give them satisfaction. If Selena had chosen those things for him, then they were precious. He carried them without shame. Academically, Damian excelled, often ranking at the top of his class. The only exception was the combat lessons. Strength was valued above all else, and as someone who had spent years struggling to survive rather than training to fight, Damian was not the strongest. He found the sword cumbersome, unwieldy. The stance felt unnatural, the weight imbalanced in his grip. No matter how much he practiced, his strikes were never powerful enough. His opponents would overpower him with brute force, leaving him frustrated and bruised. But what he lacked in raw power, he made up for in speed and agility. Years of outrunning thieves, scaling walls, leaping between ledges, and contorting his body through tight spaces had honed his ability to move unlike anyone else. His arms had developed enough strength to pull himself up onto rooftops, and his fingers could grip the smallest protrusions. He wasn't a powerhouse, but no one could match his speed. More than that, his eyes were sharp. He had spent years spotting camouflage dangers in the wild, tracking small animals, and identifying the slight color difference between edible and poisonous plants. His vision was unmatched. These abilities made him a natural with the bow. His archery skills left even the instructors astonished. Every shot, whether stationary or moving, was precise. No matter the conditions, he never missed his mark. Selena, who had watched him struggle with the sword, was the first to shower him with praise. "Damian, that was amazing! No one else can do what you just did." Her excitement was unfiltered, her admiration clear. Something in his chest tightened at her words. It was unfamiliar, something warm, something pleasant. He told himself it was just gratitude. But as she continued to smile at him, bouncing on the balls of her feet as if she had won the achievement herself, he found himself smiling back. But archery was not valued. The sword was king, and so, despite his talent, Damian's achievements in combat were dismissed. His classmates gave him half-hearted applause, acknowledging his skill but never truly respecting it. He didn't mind. It wasn't recognition he sought, and as long as Selena was pleased with his efforts, that was enough. By the end of the first year, Damian was ranked near the top academically and below average in combat. Selena, thanks to his help and occasional insistence, was also among the top students. Just behind him, Lord Farquad was pleased, and to celebrate his daughter's achievements, he threw a grand party in her honor. Damian's name was mentioned, but he knew the celebration was not truly for him. Still, he didn't mind. Seeing Selena happy, basking in the joy of the moment, was enough. It was during that celebration that he realized something had changed within him. As he watched Selena laugh and twirl in her elegant dress, as he saw the way she beamed when their father praised her, a strange warmth spread through him. It was different from gratitude, different from admiration. Something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Without realizing it, his feelings for Selena had become something more. Chapter 2. Second year of school. The beginning of the second year started off slow. The excitement of summer had faded, replaced by the familiar routine of classes, lectures, and training sessions. Students dragged their feet through the hallways, groaning about the workload ahead. But, as the days passed, they all found their rhythm again. For Damian, the transition was seamless. He picked up right where he left off, taking to his studies like a fish to water. The structured environment of the academy suited him well. He had a schedule, clear expectations, and a sense of purpose. Every subject, from history to strategy, felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and he tackled each one with the same quiet intensity that had earned him the top rankings the previous year. Selena, however, seemed different. She still excelled, but she wasn't as focused as before. More often than not, she would get distracted during lessons, tapping her fingers on the desk, doodling in the margins of her notes, or whispering with her friends when she should have been paying attention. It wasn't that she didn't care. She just didn't feel the same pressure that Damian did. Unlike him, she had grown up in a world where failure had few real consequences. If she struggled in a subject, her tutors would help her. If she slipped in rank, it was an amusing challenge rather than a true setback. Damian noticed, of course. He always noticed. So, as naturally as breathing, he took it upon himself to guide her back on track. It started small, reminding her to finish assignments, suggesting study sessions after class. When she sighed and groaned about how boring it all was, he would sit patiently, waiting until she relented and opened her books. He wasn't forceful, just firm, and she always listened. She always had. But then, one day, when Damian was out running an errand for Selena, her friends asked a question she had never considered before. "Why do you listen to him so much?" One of them asked, raising an eyebrow. "He's always telling you what to do." Selena blinked. "What? No, he's not." Another friend chimed in, tilting her head. "Come on, Selena. He pulls you away from all the fun stuff just so you can study. You always listen to him like he's your boss or something. The thought had never crossed her mind. Had she been blindly following Damian's lead? No, that wasn't right. She had always listened to him because he looked out for her. Every time he told her not to do something, it was because there was a good reason. She remembered, vividly, the time she had tried to pet a wild bane, a feline-like creature with 3 tails, glowing eyes, and incredibly soft fur. She had been enchanted bit it, drawn in by its mystical beauty. Damian had warned her not to approach, but she had hesitated too long. The bane had lashed out. She barely had time to react before Damian threw himself in front of her, shielding her from the beast's claws. The attack had left a deep gash across his chest, a wound that took weeks to heal. Even now, he bore the scar as a reminder of that moment. At the time, she had never questioned his warnings. Damian always knew when something was dangerous. If he told her not to do something, it was because he was protecting her. But now, there was no danger. No wild creatures, no lurking bandits. Yet, Damian still told her what to do. Why? The thought wormed its way into her mind, and though she didn't act on it immediately, it planted a seed of doubt. Slowly, over the course of the year, her perception of Damian's gentle guidance began to shift. What once felt like care now felt like control. While Selena wrestled with these newfound thoughts, Damian remained oblivious to the slow change in their dynamic. He noticed that she sometimes hesitated before agreeing with him, that she seemed a little more defiant than before, but he couldn't quite figure out why. And so, he left it alone, focusing instead on improving himself. The previous year, his performance in combat class had been underwhelming. No matter how hard he trained, the sword felt unnatural in his hands. Heavy, unwieldy, a weapon that resisted his every movement rather than flowing with him. His speed and agility were exceptional, but without raw power, he couldn't match his peers in direct combat. Determined not to fall behind, he adapted his training. Strength had always been his weakness, so he worked to correct it. He incorporated strength training into his daily routine, forcing his body to build muscle without sacrificing the agility that was his greatest asset. But even as his body grew stronger, the sword still felt wrong. That was when his combat instructor introduced him to daggers. The moment he picked them up, he knew. They were light, fast, an extension of his own movements rather than a burden. Unlike the sword, which demanded strength to be effective, the daggers allowed for precision and speed, 2 things Damian excelled at. He could strike quickly, defend efficiently, and move without restriction. Unlike a sword, which had to be strapped to his back or side, daggers could be concealed almost anywhere. They wouldn't weight him down. They wouldn't restrict his movements. They were the perfect weapons for someone like him. So, he threw himself into training. After class, he would venture into the vast forest behind Lord Farquad's estate. He told the servants where he was going, of course. He had no intention of worrying them, but once he was deep within the trees, he practiced relentlessly. He struck at trees, branches, stones, anything that could serve as a target. He experimented with different grips, different angles, different ways to move in and out of combat. Over time, his skill grew. He learned to wield 2 daggers at once, one for defense, the other for attack. If he was on the defensive, he could parry with one and counterattack with the other. If he had the advantage, he could unleash a relentless flurry of attacks, overwhelming an opponent before they had time to react. By the end of the year, his efforts bore fruit. His combat ranking improved. He was no longer below average. Now, he was slightly above average, respected for his unique style even he wasn't the strongest. Despite her growing defiance, Selena still listened to Damian in the end. She complained, she resisted, but she never completely ignored him. Her grades, though slightly lower than the previous year, were still among the top in the school. And as always, Lord Farquad was pleased. To celebrate, he hosted another lavish party in his daughter's honor. The halls of their estate were filled with noble guests, laughter, and music. Damian, as before, was present but not the focus. He stood at the edges of the ballroom, watching over Selena as she laughed and twirled in the glow of the chandeliers. But something was different this time. As Damian observed her, as he saw the way she interacted with her friends, the way she threw her head back in laughter at something he wasn't a part of, he felt something unfamiliar creep into his chest. Doubt. For the first time, he wondered if things would always stay the same. And Selena, as she twirled under the golden lights, caught sight of Damian standing in the shadows. She hesitated for just a moment before turning away, resuming her dance. Neither of them knew it yet, but something between them had begun to change. Chapter 3. Third Year of School. The third year began with an unexpected shift. Selena, once playful but still grounded, had changed. It wasn't just a phase or a fleeting whim. This time, it was something deeper. The moment she turned to Damian and told him, with an almost dismissive wave of her hand, that she didn't need him to take care of her anymore, he felt something crack inside him. "You should focus on yourself and let me do my own thing." She said it so casually, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if the past years of him standing by her side, ensuring her well-being, had meant nothing. Damian barely managed to hide the flicker of hurt in his eyes. He had spent his entire time at the academy keeping his promise to Lord Farquad, to protect, guide, and ensure Selena's success. And yet, here she was, discarding his presence as though it were an inconvenience. Still, he obeyed. He gave her the space she demanded, choosing to observe rather than intervene. But the more he watched, the more concerned he became. Selena, the once dedicated student, had begun ignoring her classes, whispering with friends during lectures, and outright skipping lessons just to have fun. At first, he let it be. Perhaps she would grow tired of this reckless phase. But when weeks passed, and her neglect only worsened, he had no choice but to step in. "Selena, your grades are slipping," he told her one afternoon when he caught her laughing with her friends in the courtyard instead of attending a strategy class. She rolled her eyes. "So what? You know what? Your father? My father?" She snapped, her lips curling in disdain. Her friends watched in silent amusement. "Why do you always bring him up? Are you even capable of speaking to me without using him as a shield?" Damian faltered. Selena had never spoken to him like this before. Not with such sharpness, not with such resentment. But he held firm. "He trusts me to look out for you," Damian said carefully. "And I don't want you to ruin your future because of a few distractions." Selena laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Ruin my future? Damian, I have a future, no matter what." "Do you? Or is my father's goodwill the only thing keeping you here?" Damian froze. He wasn't sure what hurt more, her words or the way she said them, as if she were just realizing it herself. But then, as if to drive the knife deeper, Selena scoffed and said words she could never take back. "Why the hell did father adopt you from the countryside anyway? Can you stop being his lapdog and just let me have fun? Or do you like using him to tell me what to do?" The world seemed to still. Her words echoed in his ears, each syllable striking like a blade to his heart. Damian stood there, motionless, his mind racing to process what had just been said. Selena's face palled as soon as the words left her lips. She hadn't meant to say it. Not like that. But the damage was done. Damian froze. The words hit him like a physical blow, robbing him of breath. He took a moment to compose himself, to suppress the emotions clawing at his throat. What could he say? It was the truth, wasn't it? He had no real place here. He was just a boy Lord Farquad had taken in. And now, Selena no longer saw him as a friend or a caretaker, just an unwanted presence in her life. Damian, after a long moment of silence, lowered his gaze. "I understand," he murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. Selena instantly realized how hurtful her words had been, but rather than apologizing, she merely turned away, pretending nothing had happened. And from that day on, he stopped trying. Word of Damian's origin spread through the academy like wildfire. At first, Selena refused to entertain her friends' curiosity, brushing off their prying questions about Damian's past. But at a late-night party, surrounded by laughter and the haze of alcohol, the pressure became too much. "Come on, Selena," one of her friends teased. "Just tell us, why is he always clinging to you? You own him, don't you?" Selena sighed. "He was adopted from the countryside, okay? My father took him in. That's why he acts the way he does. Adopted? You mean, he's not even noble?" The reactions were immediate. Shocked laughter, snide remarks, and hushed gossip. The very next day, everyone knew. The once quiet and unnoticed Damian became a target. First, it was whispers in the hallways. "He's just some poor kid pretending to belong." Then, it was the condescending looks. He's only here because of Selena's father. Otherwise, he'd be nothing. He wasn't noble, so what right did he have to act like he belonged among them? They sneered at him in the hallways, whispering as he passed. His lack of skill with a sword became proof that he was unworthy. "The sword won't listen to him because he's not a noble," they laughed. "The sword rejects him just like we do." And then, it turned physical. Students would shoulder past him roughly in the halls, knocking his books from his hands, kicking them aside when he bent to pick them up. They tripped him, pushed him against walls, dirtied his uniform. A group of boys dragged him behind the school one day, where there were no teachers to see, and left him bruised and beaten on the ground. It happened more than once, but he never said a word. He returned home with bruises on his arms, his ribs itching, his lips split from where he had been struck. The servants in the household noticed. The older ones, who had seen him grow over the years, whispered amongst themselves, concern written plainly on their faces. They tended to his wounds when they could, pressing damp cloths to his bruises, offering him kind words in the only way they were allowed to. One night, an elderly maid took his hands and squeezed them gently, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You should tell the master," she urged softly. "You don't deserve this." But Damian only shook his head. What would that change? Lord Farquad had taken him in, had given food, shelter, education. He owed him everything. Complaining about his treatment would only cause problems for Selena. And despite everything, despite her words, her actions, he didn't want to do that to her. Selena, however, was indifferent. She noticed the bruises, the limping, the injuries he tried to hide, but she never asked. If anything, she scoffed when she saw the servants tending to him. "It's not my fault if you're weak," she said one evening when she caught sight of him pressing a cold cloth to his side. "You should learn to take care of yourself instead of running to others for help." Her resentment toward him grew with each passing week. Where before she had simply ignored him, now she treated him like a nuisance. She gave him orders rather than requests, and if he hesitated even a moment, she mocked him in front of her friends. They told her Damian was using her to gain favor with her father, that he was just a poor orphan playing noble to secure his future. She listened. She believed them. One day she demanded he fetch shaved ice from a vendor nearly 40 minutes away because he has the best tasting ice. Damian, as always, obeyed. He ran, pushing himself to go faster, to get back before the ice melted. But the summer sun was relentless. By the time he returned, panting, out of breath, the ice had softened slightly. Selena's friends sneered. "It's melted," one of them said, laughing. Selena scowled, knocking the ice from his hands onto the ground. "You made me look bad," she snapped. "How useless can you be?" Then she turned to him with narrowed eyes. "Go outside and wait until I'm ready. My friends don't feel comfortable around someone like you." Damian obeyed without a word. He stood outside in the sweltering heat for 3 hours while she enjoyed her time inside, drinking, laughing, celebrating. Sweat dripped down his body, his throat parched, but he never moved. He never spoke. When she finally came outside, she barely spared him a glance before walking past him, her friends in tow. By the end of the year, Damian's grades continued to improve. He had climbed closer and closer to first place, while Selena's had dropped noticeably. She wasn't failing, but she was no longer among the top students. When Lord Farquad asked about it, Selena brushed it off, claiming the subjects had simply become more difficult and that she would improve during the break. Lord Farquad turned to Damian then, his gaze heavy. "Why aren't you helping her with her studies?" Damian felt Selena's glare before he even turned to look at her. Her eyes burned with unspoken warning. He lowered his head and forced the words from his throat. "I apologize, Lord Farquad. I failed in my duty. I promised to do better." Lord Farquad sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose before dismissing them both. That year, there was no party to celebrate. Selena's grades were nothing to celebrate, and so Damian's achievements were ignored as well. That night, Damian sat alone in his room, staring at the walls. He had never truly belonged anywhere. He was an orphan before Lord Farquad had taken him in. He had been given a home, a family, or so he had thought. Deep down he had hoped that maybe, just maybe with his sincerity and loyalty, he could be more than just another servant, more than just a tool. But it was clear now. He had never belonged to them. He never would. Chapter 4. Fourth year of school. The fourth year arrived, and with it, an undeniable change in Damian. Through constant training, his once lean frame had filled out with muscle, giving him a more athletic build. Though not as large as some of his noble classmates, his body was well defined, built for speed, endurance, and precision. His dedication to combat training had paid off, refining his skills with the bow and daggers until they felt like extensions of himself. He had spent countless hours in the forests behind Lord Farquad's estate, learning how to move undetected, strike with lethal accuracy, and track creatures through the wilderness. Yet, despite his growth, the attitudes of those around him had not changed. The whispers continued. The mocking sneers from his peers remained ever present. He had become a ghost among them, acknowledged only when there was a reason to belittle him. Selena, once his closest companion, had grown even colder. She no longer treated him as a nuisance. Now, he was nothing more than a servant in her eyes. She spoke to him only when she needed something, her words sharp and dismissive. When he handed her a book she had dropped, she scoffed. "I can pick up my own things, you know." When he reminded her to study for an important test, she rolled her eyes and muttered, "I don't need a peasant lecturing me." The household staff noticed the bruises Damian came home with more often. The servants, the only ones who showed him any kindness, tended to his wounds in secret, whispering worried words as they cleaned cuts and bandaged injuries. They had seen him return covered in dirt, his uniform torn from being shoved into walls or tripped in the halls. They had watched as he endured cruel words, watched as Selena turned her back on him, and still he never spoke a word of complaint. He never told Lord Farquad. He never sought revenge. He simply endured. Then came the announcement of the fourth-year practical exam, the hunt. The assembly hall was packed with students as the teachers laid out the rules in booming voices. Each student would be assigned a unique creature to hunt, one fitting their abilities. They had to locate, track, and kill the creature on their own. Each student would be assigned a different creature to track and kill, ensuring fairness and preventing direct competition. While the test was dangerous, it wasn't meant to be a death sentence. Even failure could lead to commendation if the student demonstrated strategy, determination, and intelligence. However, for noble students, failure was often hidden and dismissed, allowing to return to their prestigious lives without consequence. But success meant prestige, honor, and for some, the first step toward knighthood. The instructors emphasized preparation, stocking up on supplies, maintaining weapons, and always remaining vigilant. Though students would be monitored, accidents could still happen, and carelessness could mean death. At home, on the eve of the hunt, Damian approached Selena in the dimly lit hallway outside her chambers. He held out a bracelet, red cord, with a small silver trinket attached. "A good luck charm," he explained quietly. Selena stared at it for a long moment before scoffing. "You really think something like this will help me?" Rolling her eyes, but took it nonetheless. She did not realize that the bracelet was more than a simple charm. It was enchanted. If damaged, it would send a signal to the matching bracelet Damian wore. With that, the hunt began. Damian's target was an ironhide, a monstrous boar known for its nearly impenetrable hide and razor-sharp tusks. Tracking it would be no easy feat. It took him days of painstaking effort to locate its trails, moving through dense forest with silent precision. He relied on every lesson he had ever learned, every skill he had developed, to pick up the subtlest signs of the creature's presence. He moved carefully, noting disturbed underbrush, clawed up tree trunks where the ironhide had sharpened its tusks, and shallow trenches where the beast had wallowed in the mud. He found broken branches high above, signs that a creature of immense size had passed through. Footprints were rare, as the boar's sheer weight compacted the soil to near invisibility, but Damian could still make out faint impressions in the softer earth near watering holes. Droppings told him that the beast had been in the area recently. He analyzed them carefully, noting their moisture and warmth. It couldn't have been more than a few hours since the ironhide had passed. Damian took a deep breath, slowing his heartbeat, sharpening his focus. He followed the trail with the patience of a predator, knowing that rushing would only get him killed. At night, he climbed trees to rest, ensuring he wouldn't be ambushed by other creatures. He lived off the land, snaring small game and gathering edible plants, but never lighting a fire for fear of alerting the ironhide. He sharpened his daggers obsessively, and checked the tension on his bowstring, ensuring, when the time came, there would be no issues. He could not afford to make a single mistake. On the fourth day, he finally found it. The ironhide was a monstrous sight, an enormous battle-scarred boar with hide as tough as steel. It stood near a clearing, its snout buried in the dirt as it foraged. Damian remained hidden, studying its movements. He noted the way it reacted to sounds, how it shifted its weight, the brief moments when its underbelly, its one weak spot, was exposed. Using his knowledge of the forest, he set up a series of traps, creating a perimeter with sharpened stakes and tension-triggered vines. He smeared poison onto some of the stakes, harvested from venomous slants he had identified earlier. He positioned himself downwind, ensuring the boar wouldn't catch his scent. Then he fired an arrow. It struck true, embedding itself into the boar's flank. The beast roared in fury, its small eyes gleaming with rage as it charged in the direction of the attack. Damian led it into his traps, maneuvering through the trees with practiced ease. It crashed through the first set of stakes, impaling itself slightly but not enough to stop its rampage. The vines snapped around its legs, slowing it, but the Iroide's raw strength tore through them. Damian threw a dagger, striking its eye, causing the beast to thrash wildly. Just when he thought he had the upper hand, the Iron-Eyed turned sharply and charged straight at him. He tried to dodge, but it was too fast. The massive beast slammed into him, sending him flying into a tree. Pain exploded through his ribs, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. Gritting his teeth, Damian forced himself up. The boar snorted, pawing at the ground, preparing for another charge. Damian staggered but steadied himself. He couldn't overpower it. He had to outthink it. Using the trees as cover, he maneuvered carefully, firing another arrow at its exposed underbelly. The beast howled in agony. Taking advantage of its momentary weakness, Damian leaped onto its back, driving both daggers into the gaps between its thick plates of hide. The iron hide bucked wildly, but he held on, twisting the blades deeper. Blood sprayed across his hands. The beast stumbled, then collapsed with a final, pained grunt. For a long moment, Damian simply lay on his back, staring at the sky, his body itching and breath ragged. He had won. After hours of rest, he collected the required trophy and stored it in his pack. He washed his wounds in a nearby stream, then cut and cooked a piece of the Ironhide's meat. It was tough, but he savored every bite, knowing that he had earned it. Then, just as he was finishing his meal, the bracelet on his wrist blinked. Selena, the charm he had given her, had been damaged, sending a signal to his own. He didn't know exactly where she was, only a general area. But it was enough. Without hesitation, he grabbed his pack and took off into the forest, sprinting toward her. Chapter 5. The Rescue. The night was thick with tension as Damian moved through the dense forest with a focused intensity. His body was already bruised and sore from previous skirmishes, but the urgency of Selena's peril propelled him forward. Every step he took, every muscle in his body burned, but the thought of her lying in the dirt, vulnerable in danger, pushed him to move faster. The sound of the trees whipping past him drowned out all other thoughts. His mind sharpened, as if he was tuning into the surroundings like an instrument, listening for any clue to guide him to her. He finally spotted an administrator, moving at a much slower pace through the woods. Damian didn't hesitate. He shot forward like a predator closing in on its prey, reaching the man in moments, his boots making little sound as he skidded to a halt. The administrator, a middle-aged man with a heavy-set frame and a weathered face, looked up in surprise as Damian appeared before him. "Are you going to help Selena?" Damian asked, his voice sharp, cutting through the night air. His tone was flat, but beneath it, the urgency was undeniable. His heart pounded, and his mind raced. Every moment wasted could cost Selena her life. The administrator blinked, his eyes widening as he processed the question. "I was on my way, yes," he stammered, but Damian's impatience was palpable. The administrator paused, then added, "She's just a little further up ahead. I was coming to help her, but we need to be careful." Careful. Damian's voice rose, frustration creeping in. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he looked at the administrator, his gaze fierce. He could already feel the seconds slipping away. Careful. She doesn't have time for a careful. She's injured, and that thing's out there hunting her. I need to know where she is now. The administrator seemed taken aback by the sudden intensity in Damian's voice, but he quickly recovered. She's just beyond the ridge, near the old oak tree," he said, pointing off to the side. But Damian didn't wait for the rest of the explanation. He turned, already moving faster, his legs propelling him forward, each step calculated as he bounded through the trees. The administrator called out, but Damian ignored him, his focus solely on Selena's location now. His impatience boiled over. How could the administrator be moving so slowly in such a dire situation? "I'll meet you there," Damian muttered under his breath as he sped away, his voice barely audible but edged with exasperation. The administrator, left standing in the forest with only the distant rustle of leaves to accompany him, could only watch as Damian disappeared into the darkness. The distance between them was quickly closing. As Damian sprinted toward the ridge, his mind was focused entirely on the task ahead. He could picture Selena's face, pale and frightened, the fear that had gripped her when he'd last seen her. That image fueled him, urging him to push through his exhaustion. His muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to stop. He needed to get to her. The administrator, who had hesitated and was still walking at a careful pace, was no longer in Damian's thoughts. He had no time for the slow. There was only one goal: reaching Selena before it was too late. The location was close, and as Damian finally emerged from the shadows of the trees, his eyes fell upon Selena, bloodied and trembling, still clutching her sword with white knuckles. A massive nightshade, its black fur blending seamlessly with the dark of the forest, stalked her, its glowing eyes fixed in a predatory gaze. Damian's heart raced, but his focus remained clear. Without hesitation, he leaped from the tree branch above, his momentum carrying him forward as he pulled his bow from his back. In the split second before his feet touched the ground, 3 arrows were already loosed. He aimed with an intensity that only came from years of training and experience. The first arrow struck the nightshade's foot, causing it to yelp in pain and stagger back, momentarily confused. The second lodged itself into its eye, eliciting an agonized howl that reverberated through the trees. The third arrow pierced the joint where the nightshade's leg met its body, forcing the beast to stagger backward. Damian landed softly, rolling with the impact and coming on a low crouch, already reaching for another arrow. The nightshade, now aware of its new adversary, growled menacingly, its caution rising. Each of Damian's shots pushed it back, but it was clear the creature was smart, an apex predator that relied on its quick reflexes and instincts. Damian didn't just rely on his bow. His surroundings became an extension of his arsenal. He darted between trees, using their trunks to block the creature's view, moving like a shadow, never staying in one place for too long. As the nightshade prowled closer, he dropped his bow, his fingers curling around his daggers, ready for close combat. The fight turned into a deadly dance. Damian parried the beast's slashing claws with his daggers, feeling the vibration of each impact shoot up his arms. The nightshade's speed was terrifying, but Damian's intellect, his ability to predict its next move, kept him one step ahead. He used the terrain to his advantage, leading the creature through uneven ground, forcing it to slow as it maneuvered around roots and rocks. But Damian's body was growing wary. Blood began to stain his tunic as a deep gash from a claw tore into his side. The pain was intense, but he couldn't afford to give in to it. He pushed forward, his mind racing, calculating every move. The nightshade, sensing an opportunity, lunged at him, its jaws snapping shut with a terrifying speed. Damian barely managed to dodge, the creature's fangs grazing his shoulder. The world spun with the rush of blood from his wound, but he refused to fall. He was close now, closer than ever to ending this fight. As the beast circled again, its growl reverberating through the night, Damian's mind clicked into a final, desperate strategy. The nightshade would not let him take Selena easily, but it was growing frustrated. He could feel the shift in its posture. Its aggression was waning, but it would fight until the very end. He needed to end it now. With a final surge of strength, he dashed, picking up his bow once more, knocking an arrow with trembling hands. His vision was blurry from the blood loss, but he aimed carefully. The beast was nearing the trees again, positioning itself for another attack. Damian knew this was his moment. He pulled the string back with all the force he could muster, aiming for the creature's heart. He fired. The arrow flew true, piercing through the air, and for a heartbeat, everything seemed to slow. The nightshade let out a final, guttural snarl before its body slumped, collapsing to the ground with a mighty crash. Damian's vision swam as exhaustion and blood loss overtook him. He couldn't even see the creature's death, only feeling the rush of his victory before his beat gave out, as his knees buckly fell and everything went black. Selena, having been carried away by the administrator, was still barely conscious, her mind spinning with the events unfolding in front of her. She had been watching Damian from the moment he arrived, and with every arrow, every calculated movement, her awe grew. His precision, his intelligence in the face of a brutal battle. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. This was the Damian she had never known, the man who had hidden his true strength beneath the surface for so long. She watched as he weaved through the trees, using them to block the creature's view, anticipating each strike, each counter. Her heart raced as he fought, but the sight of him staggering, his blood staining the earth beneath him, was too much. She tried to call out to him, but before the words left her lips her vision blurred, and the world around her darkened. Chapter 6. The End a Beginning. Damian awoke days later in a sterile, quiet room. His body ached with every movement, his muscles stiff from disuse. It took a moment for his senses to adjust, but when they did, the reality of his injury settled in. He had survived, barely. The doctor's voice echoed in the room, telling him he would need rest, that he was lucky to be alive. The old scar that had marked his chest when he saved Selena years ago had company, a new one now going in the opposite direction, forming a cross. He would carry it with him, just as he carried the weight of his choices. The door creaked open and Selena entered, her face pale and streaked with tears. She sat beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his. She was apologizing before he could even say a word, overwhelmed with guilt and emotion. Her voice broke as she thanked him, the words tumbling out in a rush. She promised to treat him better, to never make the same mistakes again. Damian smiled gently, though it was a smile tinged with sadness. "It's all in the past," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lord Farquad insisted he recovered at the manor, noting that his staff would be able to provide much better care than at the hospital. Selena agreed, stating that she would be there to nurture Damian back to health, almost excited to take care of him. Without waiting for an answer, her father stepped out to make the arrangements. And so, over the course of a month, as Damian recovered under the care of the servants, with Selena constantly by his side, she tried so hard to make up for the cruel way she had treated him before, hoping to find a way to rebuild the bridge she had burned. She brought him food, tended to his wounds, and sat by his side whenever he rested. She apologized endlessly, in small ways and large, trying to show him that she had changed, that she was no longer the person who had pushed him away. At first, Damian was patient with her, smiling gently when she brought him his meals or helped into a comfortable position on the couch. He accepted her care, her presence, but there was always a noticeable distance between them. His smile never reached his eyes in the way it once had, and when her hand touched his, it felt like a brief, fleeting warmth before he withdrew, whether physically or emotionally. No matter how much she tried to be kind, she couldn't bridge that gap. He was so close, yet so far. Selena pushed these thoughts aside, focusing on one thing, proving to Damian that she truly cared for him now. She told herself that time would heal the wounds of the past, and, eventually, he would come to see that she was no longer the girl who had been so careless with his heart. But as the weeks wore on, she couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much she tried to care for him, it was never enough to close the space that had grown between them. One day, determined to do something special for him, Selena decided she would go to the market and buy one of Damian's favorite meals, a dish he had once enjoyed during the days when they had been close. It was something simple, but she hoped it would remind him of the bond they once shared. She spent hours searching for the right ingredients and took her time preparing it. As she finally made her way back to the manor, a sense of unease settled over her. The sun was beginning to set as she arrived at the estate, and the quietness in the air made her skin crawl. She called out for Damian, hoping to hear his voice, but there was no answer. Her heart skipped a beat, and a pit formed in her stomach. Something wasn't right. She rushed up the stairs, her footsteps quickening, the fear growing with every step. When she reached his room, she didn't hesitate to call out again. "Guess what I got you," she said, a grin spreading on her face. But as the words left her lips, her voice faltered. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw that the room was empty. A chill ran through her, and she froze. Her gaze swept over the room, but there was no sign of Damian. The bed was undisturbed, his belongings were neatly in place, but there was no Damian. Her pulse quickened as she looked around frantically. Her eyes eventually landed on a piece of paper sitting on the table by the window. Trembling, she reached out and picked it up. As she read through the letter, her heart sank with each word. Damian had written of his deep gratitude for Lord Farquad's kindness, for giving him a chance at a better life. He had spoken to her father, and they both agreed that Damian had repaid his debt. He no longer owed them anything, and with that, he would leave the manor. There was no bitterness in his words, only resignation. He spoke of his feelings for her, how he had once cared for her deeply, but had never dared speak them, believing himself unworthy. He had planned to use his time at the manor to make something of himself so that one day he could confess his love and be the man she deserved. But as time passed, her actions, her treatment of him, had proven that there was no future for them. He would always be someone beneath her, and so their paths had diverged. He wished her happiness, but he knew it was time for him to leave, to move on. Tears blurred Selena's vision as she stood there, clutching the letter, her heart shattered as the weight of his words settled in. She had treated him terribly, and now he was gone. He had been the one person who had always looked out for her, the one person who had cared about her well-being above all else, and she had pushed him away. She cried for the years they had lost, for the man she had let slip through her fingers, and for the bitter realization that he had already made his decision to move on. She wept in silence, the room cold and empty around her, a mirror of the void he had left behind. Prologue. The years passed, and Selena found herself rising in rank, eventually leading an elite night squad tasked with quelling rebellions and hunting down dangerous creatures threatening the kingdom. She never stopped hoping that she would find Damian again, that somehow their paths would cross. She heard rumors, stories of a man who had saved villages from monsters, of a warrior who had overthrown corrupt nobles. Every story made her heart race, but he was always out of reach. But one day, fate finally seemed to smile on her. Selena had received word that Damian was living in a small town, and without hesitation, she dropped everything. She traveled there with all the hope in her heart, praying that she would find him and finally have the chance to make amends. When she arrived, she searched the town for any sign of him. She walked through the streets, asking questions, until finally she spotted him. There he was. Damian's face was more mature now, his hair slightly longer, but there was no mistaking him. He was walking down the street, carrying a small bundle of groceries. And beside him, a woman. She was smiling up at him lovingly, her hand resting on his arm. Damian looked content, happy even. He wasn't the man she had once known, the one who had been so lost and broken. He was someone else now, someone at peace. Her heart broke as she watched them, realizing that whatever chance she had once hoped for was gone. She couldn't bring herself to interrupt their happiness. She stood there, a quiet smile on her lips despite the aching pain in her chest, and wished him happiness. Then, without a word, she turned away, her footsteps soft as she left the town behind. She had finally found him, but the reunion she had dreamed of was not the one she had imagined. Damian had moved on, and so must she. If you enjoyed the story, why not drop a like and maybe consider subscribing? I plan to upload new and unique stories several times a week.